For today's Spotlight on COVID, I'm joined by Dr. Maria Varaki, lecturer in international law on the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Dr. Varaki's research looks at international law with a focus on public and human rights legislation, as well as legal theory. Since the COVID-19 crisis, governments around the world have taken unprecedented measures, declaring states of emergency and taking extreme decisions in light of public health threats from the virus. Responsibility has fallen on world leaders to implement key measures and follow advice based on local circumstances and international organizations such as the World Health Organization. But do they have a duty to act in response to the pandemic? And if so, what legal accountability is there for the good and bad decisions they make?
The humanity, it's not the first time that deals with the pandemic. It's just that we do deal now with the pandemic. And it's true, the very first reaction was about legal accountability. What kind of legal accountability? Because we always turn into, or we think, that always law is the answer. So although I'm a lawyer, it's true, we go into law. And here, when it comes to legal accountability, one can find a couple of layers. So we talk about the leadership, what kind of individual accountability, to what extent different leaders have a legal duty to protect public health in their countries and prevent the outbreak of the epidemic. We talk a lot also about state responsibility. There is lots of discussion, debate, and controversy about the role of China at the beginning of the epidemic, to what extent, they revealed all the information or not. But not only China, other countries such as the United States, when President Trump announced that the United States is withdrawing from the WHO. So there is a question there, to what extent they still have a responsibility, to pay their contribution to the WHO. And there is another layer of responsibility, and that deals, with the responsibility of international organizations such as the WHO. To be honest, although I'm a lawyer myself and I recognize the importance of law, I think the situation is far more complicated than being confined only in legal parameters. And although there are some legal channels that various actors can pursue in order to try to establish, you see, I'm very careful, some kind of accountability in those various levels. I believe, that this challenge actually proves to some extent the limits of law. I have read a lot and I follow the discussions that maybe, that some states could proceed before the International Court of Justice, I think these are things that we are going to see, to what extent there will be a very concise framework of legal accountability. I'm not suggesting that there isn't, I'm suggesting that there is, but I'm saying, that it's more complex, more nuanced, and definitely, it's not the only answer that we have for this epidemic.
That's really interesting. I think we'll just have to see how that plays out going forward. So in trying to control the spread of COVID-19, many states have used technology and data to identify their cases and for subsequent contact tracing. We've seen examples of such use of artificial intelligence and surveillance in countries such as South Korea, Singapore, and most notably Israel. So with the latter, they're using counter-terrorism legislation to track down affected individuals. Is there a risk some states are going too far in their use of such legislation to curb civil liberties and infringe on data privacy in the name of fighting the virus?
Yeah, this is a very important question. I would even say that it's more important than the first question regarding its immediate effect. I have been a member of a subcommittee of the International Law Association devoted to the research of human rights in times of emergency. And from very beginning, we started working, we started observing the behavior of different states. So different states declared de facto, de jure states of emergency and took restrictive measures in order to be able to tackle with the expansion, with the breakout of the pandemic. And other states did something that we call a de facto state of emergency. So without declaring officially a state of emergency that curtails particular civil liberties, in fact, they adopted legislation or they took administrative measures that had the exactly same result. So we have a couple of rights that deal with human actions, such as the right to movement, the right to health, the right to public to assembly, the right to freedom of expression. That we have seen in different countries that have been affected by those types of measures. State of emergencies are legal, when they are declared and substantiated within the legal framework that is accepted by the international legal community. However, we have seen, in several countries that you mentioned already, that on top of the other measures that we have, such as limitation of freedom of movement or freedom of expression, the usage of artificial intelligence, of surveillance technologies have been extremely widespread used. You mentioned the examples of South Korea, of Singapore, but also of Israel. And Israel is very particular because there, for the first time, they used counterterrorism technology to track down potential COVID cases. Of course, legal scholars in Israel immediately challenged, that type of legislation before the Israeli High Court. But what is scary, what is worrisome, and this is where I would like to raise the alert, is that it varies from country to country, as I said, and there is the risk of a kind of normalization of those exceptional measures into our daily life. So if we incorporate those exceptional measures into typical normal legislation and they become the new reality, then there is, of course, fear for the civil liberties. And I can tell you that there are many institutions, the UN institutions, but also many NGOs, many scholars, many experts, many activists who vigorously observe and create databases with those developments, because we need to be alert, we need to be aware, and definitely, we need to raise our voice in this balance between what we call it, either it's public, either it's privacy or health versus public health, and other types of public interest.
That's really insightful, especially with all the security stuff going around at the moment. So I know that some scholars have said that globalization is to blame for the pandemic. Crises like COVID also make us reflect on how connected we are to each other, locally and globally, so as a human agency, who we vote for and who makes the decisions we live by. One might say that to halt the pandemic, we need to accept shared responsibility and work together. In your opinion, what has this pandemic taught us about ourselves, and how will COVID-19 influence the future leaders we elect?
Wow, this is the $1 million question. Here I would like to bring our listeners or observers, that bring their attention to a very interesting article I read a couple of months ago at the beginning of the epidemic by the Israeli historian Yuval Harari, speaking, about the new challenges that we face with the pandemic. So Harari there identified two areas. One was, this need for further collaboration, for shared responsibility, versus a return to isolationism, to sovereignty, to close borders, to do things for ourselves, within our own countries. And the second area that he identified, which was very much what we discussed in the second question, had to do actually, with liberties and with the importance, to avoid a police state that imposes those types of restrictions versus well-informed global citizens who are well informed, who avoid fake information if possible. This is a major discussion nowadays, and who know very well what it, and it has to do a lot, with who we vote for at the end of the day. There are many calls about good leadership. There are many calls about effective leadership. I would add here also ethical leadership. And we saw several reports to what extent maybe female leaders are better leaders, than male leaders, because they can show more empathy, more compassion. To what extent, leaders who manage to convey a clear message of communication, manage to convince, the people. But also we saw examples, where leaders trusted experts like doctors, like biologists, and we saw examples where leaders, defied science, and of course, all of us, I mean, even nowadays, as I heard, Facebook and Twitter removed a post by President Trump on misinformation about COVID. I think this pandemic, is a very, very good opportunity for all of us to think and to act responsible when we choose our leaders, and when we choose who we vote for, because the decisions and the choices these leaders made actually, determine our life. Here I would like to end this short discussion, that with something that it's very, maybe it has become cliche the last year, the last month. Everybody reads Camus, the famous Algerian writer, and the plague. And there, Camus wrote, that maybe the only way to deal with this situation is decency. And I think, when you ask me, I believe more and more that this epidemic is a call for decency, is a call for decent leadership, but also for decent individual behavior.
I mean, I couldn't agree more in terms of electing decent leaders as we go forward. And obviously, it will be up to the people of the world now to decide with current elections taking place. Exactly. So on that note, I just want to say thank you for joining me today. It's been great to have you here for this discussion. So thank you.